The morning mist hung heavy over downtown Phoenix as Dr. Marcus Reeves adjusted his rearview mirror for the third time in 5 minutes. Something felt wrong, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The usual rush-hour traffic crawled along Interstate 10, but there was an odd quality to the silence between car horns. People seemed more agitated than usual, their faces pressed against windows with expressions he'd never seen before. Marcus had spent 15 years as an emergency room physician, and his instincts for danger had been finely tuned by countless nights dealing with the unexpected. Today, those instincts were screaming. His radio crackled to life with reports that made his blood run cold. Multiple hospitals across the valley were reporting an unprecedented surge in patients exhibiting bizarre symptoms. Extreme aggression, complete loss of speech, and most disturbing of all, an apparent immunity to pain that left medical staff baffled and terrified. The CDC had been contacted, but their response teams were still hours away. Marcus pressed harder on the accelerator, weaving between cars as he headed toward Phoenix General Hospital where his shift was about to begin. Meanwhile, across town in the suburban neighborhood of Ahwatukee, Elena Rodriguez was experiencing her own moment of dread. The kindergarten teacher had arrived early to prepare her classroom when she noticed her colleague, Mrs. Patterson, standing motionless in the hallway. Elena called out a cheerful good morning, but received no response. As she approached, she could see that something was fundamentally wrong with the older woman's posture and breathing. Mrs. Patterson's shoulders rose and fell with an irregular, almost mechanical rhythm, and when she finally turned around, Elena gasped. Her colleague's eyes were completely bloodshot, and a low, guttural sound emerged from her throat instead of words. Elena backed away slowly, her teaching instincts kicking in as she remembered the emergency protocols drilled into every educator. She reached for her phone to call the school nurse, but before she could dial, Mrs. Patterson lunged forward with a speed and ferocity that defied explanation. Elena barely managed to slam her classroom door shut, her hands trembling as she turned the lock. Through the small window, she watched in horror as Mrs. Patterson clawed at the glass with her fingernails, leaving bloody streaks while making sounds that belonged in nightmares rather than an elementary school. At the same time, David Chen, a construction foreman working on a high-rise project downtown, was dealing with his own crisis. 3 of his workers had called in sick with what they described as severe flu symptoms, but when 2 of them showed up anyway, David knew immediately that something was seriously wrong. The men moved with jerky, uncoordinated movements, and they seemed unable to respond to direct questions. When David approached to send them home, one of them grabbed his arm with crushing force, and David saw the same terrifying transformation in the man's eyes that Elena had witnessed. The construction site erupted into chaos as the infected workers began attacking their colleagues with tools and bare hands. David managed to sound the emergency alarm, but not before witnessing scenes that would haunt him forever. Men he had worked alongside for years were suddenly turning on each other with a violence that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human nature. David grabbed his radio and began calling every emergency number he could think of, but the responses he received suggested that similar incidents were happening all across the city. As the morning progressed, the 3 strangers found themselves connected by a common thread of survival and a growing realization that whatever was happening was far bigger than isolated incidents. Marcus arrived at the hospital to find the emergency department in complete pandemonium. Patients were restrained to gurneys while medical staff worked desperately to understand a condition that seemed to rob people of their humanity while leaving them physically stronger and more aggressive than ever before. Elena managed to escape her school building and was driving aimlessly through neighborhoods where she could see emergency vehicles racing in every direction. David had evacuated his construction site and was trying to reach his family when he realized that normal communication channels were becoming increasingly unreliable. The mysterious threat was spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated, and the city's infrastructure was beginning to crumble under the weight of something unprecedented. As sirens wailed in the distance and smoke began to rise from various parts of the metropolitan area, these 3 individuals were about to discover that their survival would depend not just on their own resourcefulness, but on their ability to trust strangers and make impossible decisions in a world that no longer followed any recognizable rules. The final hour for humanity as they knew it had begun, and the choices made in the coming days would determine whether civilization could survive the rising tide of an enemy that had once been their friends, family, and neighbors. By noon, Phoenix had transformed into a battlefield that defied comprehension. The mysterious infection wasn't following any known pattern of disease transmission, spreading through the population with a speed that left epidemiologists scrambling for explanations. Dr. Marcus Reeves found himself barricaded in the hospital's medication storage room with 2 nurses and a security guard, watching through reinforced glass as the emergency department became a war zone. The infected moved in coordinated groups, displaying an intelligence that contradicted everything he knew about rabies or similar conditions. They seemed to communicate through guttural sounds and gestures, working together to overwhelm healthy individuals with terrifying efficiency. The hospital's backup generators hummed ominously as the main power grid flickered throughout the building. Marcus could hear the infected moving through the corridors above, their footsteps creating an irregular rhythm that sent chills down his spine. Nurse Patricia Williams, a 20-year veteran of emergency medicine, was monitoring radio frequencies on a portable device, her face growing paler with each transmission. Reports were flooding in from every major hospital in the valley. The infection rate was astronomical, and more disturbing still, it appeared that anyone who died from injuries inflicted by the infected would reanimate within minutes, joining the growing horde that swept through the city like a relentless tide. Elena Rodriguez had abandoned her car 3 blocks from the school when traffic became completely gridlocked. The streets were filled with abandoned vehicles, their doors hanging open as if their occupants had fled in sudden panic. She moved carefully through the suburban maze, staying close to fences and walls that offered quick escape routes. The normal sounds of neighborhood life had been replaced by distant screaming, breaking glass, and the unsettling moans that seemed to echo from every direction. Elena had managed to contact her sister Maria by text message before cell towers became overwhelmed, learning that the infection had reached their family's neighborhood on the other side of town. As she navigated through backyards and side streets, Elena encountered other survivors moving with the same cautious desperation. An elderly man named Robert Kim was carrying a baseball bat and moving toward the main commercial district, hoping to reach his pharmacy before the infected overran it completely. A young mother named Jessica Blake was pushing a stroller containing supplies instead of a baby, having left her children with relatives in Tucson the previous day. These brief encounters with other survivors gave Elena hope, but also highlighted the terrible randomness of who had been affected and who remained human. David Chen's construction experience had given him unique advantages in navigating the urban landscape during the chaos. He moved through the city using maintenance tunnels, fire escapes, and rooftops that most people never knew existed. From his elevated vantage points, he could see the true scope of the disaster unfolding below. Entire city blocks were burning as emergency services became overwhelmed or were attacked while attempting to respond to calls. The infected seemed drawn to noise and movement, gathering in massive groups around hospitals, schools, and shopping centers where people had initially sought refuge. David's radio continued to receive fragmented communications from other construction crews, police units, and emergency responders scattered throughout the metropolitan area. The messages painted a picture of coordinated societal collapse that was happening faster than anyone had prepared for. Military units were being deployed from nearby Luke Air Force Base, but early reports suggested that conventional crowd control methods were proving ineffective against adversaries who felt no pain and showed no fear. The most chilling development came through official emergency broadcasts that managed to reach the remaining functional communication networks. Government scientists were confirming that the infected retained enough cognitive function to use tools, open doors, and even operate simple machinery. This wasn't the mindless plague that horror movies had prepared the population to expect. The infected were learning, adapting, and becoming more dangerous with each passing hour. As afternoon shadows grew longer, the 3 survivors found themselves moving toward the same general area of the city, though they remained unaware of each other's proximity. Marcus had made the difficult decision to leave the hospital when it became clear that the building was completely compromised. Elena was following emergency evacuation routes that led toward the downtown area where official rescue operations were supposedly being coordinated. David was moving in the same direction after receiving radio communications suggesting that a safe zone was being established in the government district. The infected had claimed vast territories throughout Phoenix, but their behavior suggested they were being guided by some form of collective intelligence that grew stronger as their numbers increased. Survivors who witnessed large groups of infected reported seeing them work together to breach fortified positions, set traps for fleeing humans, and even use vehicles to block escape routes. The enemy was evolving faster than humanity could adapt, and the window for organized resistance was closing rapidly. The spreading chaos had reached a tipping point where individual survival would soon depend entirely on finding other uninfected humans and working together against an adversary that grew more formidable with each person it claimed. The downtown Phoenix government district had become an eerie monument to abandoned authority. Traffic lights blinked uselessly over empty intersections while official vehicles sat abandoned with their doors hanging open, radios still crackling with unanswered emergency calls. Dr. Marcus Reeves emerged from a storm drain access point near the federal building, his medical scrubs torn and stained from his harrowing escape through the hospital's maintenance tunnels. The promised safe zone was nowhere to be seen, but the absence of the infected in this particular area suggested that something was keeping them away. Elena Rodriguez spotted the movement from her hiding place behind an overturned food truck. Her teacher's instincts for assessing strangers kicked in as she watched the man emerge from underground, noting his medical clothing and the careful way he surveyed his surroundings before moving. She had been crouched behind the vehicle for nearly an hour, trying to decide whether the government building might offer genuine refuge or become another trap. The sounds of approaching infected from the east had been growing steadily louder, suggesting that their temporary sanctuary wouldn't last much longer. David Chin had reached the same area by scaling the exterior of a parking garage and using emergency ladders to descend near the courthouse. His construction background had taught him to read the structural integrity of buildings, and something about the government district's layout bothered him. The streets were too clean, the abandoned vehicles too neatly positioned, as if someone had deliberately arranged the scene. When he noticed movement near the federal building, his survival instincts went on high alert. Two figures were moving toward each other with the cautious body language of fellow survivors rather than the jerky, predatory movements of the infected. The three strangers converged near the building's main entrance, each keeping careful distance while assessing whether the others posed a threat. Marcus spoke first, his medical training giving him experience in calming frightened people during crisis situations. He identified himself and explained his escape from the hospital, sharing crucial information about the infected's behavior patterns that he had observed. Elena reciprocated by describing her experience at the school and her observations during her journey through the suburban areas. David contributed his knowledge of the city's infrastructure and the disturbing coordination he had witnessed among large groups of infected. Their tentative alliance was interrupted by a discovery that changed everything. While searching the federal building for supplies and communication equipment, Elena noticed that one of the offices had been hastily abandoned with critical documents still scattered across desks. The papers belonged to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and they contained preliminary reports about biological research being conducted at a facility outside the city. Marcus's medical background allowed him to interpret the technical language, and what he read made his blood run cold. The documents revealed that the outbreak wasn't a natural occurrence or accidental laboratory contamination. References to controlled deployment and behavioral modification protocols suggested that the infection had been deliberately engineered and released as part of some kind of experimental program. Even more disturbing were communications indicating that the researchers had expected the infected to retain higher cognitive functions, making them more effective at spreading the condition while remaining controllable through specific technological interfaces. David's engineering background helped him understand the technical specifications mentioned in the papers. The research facility was located in a remote area north of the city, built into a mountainside with multiple underground levels and independent power systems. According to the documents, the facility contained both the source of the infection and potentially the means to reverse or control it. However, the papers also indicated that the researchers had lost contact with the facility's automated systems several days before the outbreak began, suggesting that something had gone catastrophically wrong with their containment protocols. Elena discovered the most chilling piece of information in a series of encrypted communications that had been partially decoded. The infection appeared to be spreading according to a predetermined pattern, with the infected being guided by some form of signal transmission from the research facility. This explained their coordinated behavior and suggested that someone or something was still controlling the outbreak from a central location. The implications were terrifying because it meant that the infected weren't just mindless monsters, but components of a larger system designed for purposes that remained unclear. As evening approached and the sounds of infected grew closer to their temporary refuge, the 3 survivors realized they faced an impossible choice. They could try to escape the city and hope to find safety in more remote areas, or they could attempt to reach the research facility and potentially discover a way to stop the outbreak at its source. The government building's resources had provided them with maps, communication equipment, and enough supplies for several days, but they also knew that staying in one place too long would eventually lead to discovery by the growing horde that continued to sweep through the city. Their decision was made for them when David's radio picked up a weak transmission from the research facility itself, suggesting that someone was still alive at the source of the outbreak and desperately trying to communicate with the outside world. The radio transmission that crackled through David's equipment at sunset carried the desperate voice of Dr. Amanda Foster, a senior researcher at the mountain facility. Her words painted a picture of hope that seemed too good to be true in their current nightmare. She claimed that her team had successfully developed a countermeasure to the infection, but they needed healthy subjects to help distribute it throughout the contaminated zones. Most compelling of all, she provided coordinates to a secure evacuation point where military personnel were supposedly gathering survivors for transport to the research facility. Marcus felt his medical instincts conflicting with his survival training as he listened to the transmission. The doctor's terminology was precise and her knowledge of the infection's characteristics seemed genuine, but something about the timing felt orchestrated. Elena noticed the same inconsistency, remembering her experience with Mrs. Patterson and how the infected had shown signs of coordinated behavior that suggested external control. David's engineering background made him suspicious of any facility that claimed to have working solutions when the rest of civilization had collapsed in less than 24 hours. Despite their reservations, the promise of a genuine safe zone and potential cure proved too tempting to ignore. The coordinates led to an industrial complex on the outskirts of Phoenix, far enough from the city center to avoid the heaviest concentrations of infected but close enough to reach before dawn. Dr. Foster's voice continued to broadcast at regular intervals, providing updates on the evacuation process and reassuring survivors that help was finally arriving. The transmissions included specific details about the layout of the industrial complex and emergency protocols that suggested legitimate military involvement. As they made their way through the darkened city streets, the 3 survivors noticed an unusual absence of infected in the areas surrounding their destination. The creatures that had been relentlessly pursuing any signs of human activity throughout the day seemed to be avoiding certain neighborhoods entirely. Marcus hypothesized that the military might have established some kind of perimeter defense, while Elena wondered if the infected were being deliberately directed away from the evacuation site. David's concerns deepened when he realized that the route they were following had been subtly cleared of obstacles, as if someone had prepared a specific path for survivors to follow. The industrial complex appeared exactly as Dr. Foster had described, with military vehicles positioned around a central warehouse and floodlights illuminating a secure perimeter. Uniformed personnel moved with professional efficiency, directing small groups of survivors toward processing stations where they underwent medical screenings and registration procedures. The sight of organized authority figures implementing proper emergency protocols provided tremendous psychological relief after hours of chaos and uncertainty. Marcus was particularly impressed by the medical equipment visible through the warehouse windows, which appeared to be sophisticated enough to actually develop and produce treatments for the infection. Elena felt her teacher's protective instincts engaging as she watched families being separated during the processing procedures. Children were being taken to what officials described as specialized medical care areas, while adults were assigned to different sections of the facility based on their health status and potential exposure to the infected. The separation protocol was explained as necessary for preventing cross-contamination, but something about the way the children disappeared into interior areas of the complex made her uncomfortable. She tried to express her concerns to Marcus and David, but the overwhelming relief of finding organized rescue operations made her doubts seem like paranoid anxiety. David's suspicions crystallized when he noticed that the military vehicles surrounding the complex were positioned to prevent people from leaving rather than protecting them from external threats. The personnel checking identification documents were asking detailed questions about survivors' backgrounds, family connections, and technical skills that seemed more like recruitment screening than medical evaluation. Most disturbing of all, he observed that people who had been processed earlier were not visible anywhere in the areas where new arrivals were being held. The trap became apparent when Dr. Foster's voice returned to the radio frequencies, but this time her transmission was being broadcast from inside the complex rather than the remote mountain facility. Marcus realized that the entire evacuation operation was a carefully orchestrated deception designed to gather healthy humans for unknown purposes. Elena noticed that the military personnel were wearing equipment that seemed designed for handling biological specimens rather than protecting survivors. David discovered that the vehicles they had seen from a distance were actually mobile laboratories equipped with containment systems and research apparatus. As the three survivors tried to signal each other about their growing alarm, they realized that the processing procedures were designed to separate and isolate individuals before they could organize any form of resistance. The safe zone was actually a collection facility, and the people who had arrived before them had likely become subjects for whatever experiments were being conducted in the complex's interior areas. Their only advantage was that they had entered together and managed to maintain visual contact, but escape would require coordinating their efforts without alerting the personnel who were monitoring all survivor activities. The promise of salvation had become their most dangerous trap yet. The moment of truth came when Elena noticed that the children from earlier processing groups were being loaded into unmarked vehicles through a rear entrance of the complex. The sight of frightened young faces pressed against tinted windows shattered any remaining illusions about the facility's true purpose. She managed to catch Marcus's attention during his medical screening, using subtle hand signals she had learned during teacher safety training to communicate the danger. David had already begun studying the complex's structural layout, his construction experience revealing that the building's foundation connected to an extensive network of utility tunnels that could provide an escape route. Their window of opportunity opened when a power fluctuation caused by the facility's excessive energy demands temporarily disrupted the lighting and surveillance systems. Marcus created a medical emergency by triggering an allergic reaction using medication from his pocket, drawing several personnel away from their posts to assist with what appeared to be a genuine crisis. Elena used the distraction to slip away from her processing station, while David located an access panel to the underground utility systems that he had spotted during his earlier reconnaissance of the building's structural elements. The utility tunnels beneath the industrial complex were a maze of steam pipes, electrical conduits, and water mains that connected to the broader Phoenix infrastructure network. David's familiarity with construction specifications allowed him to navigate the cramped spaces with confidence, leading Marcus and Elena through passages that were barely wide enough for a single person. The tunnels carried sound in unpredictable ways, amplifying their movements while muffling the activity above ground, making it impossible to determine whether their escape had been discovered or if pursuit was already underway. As they moved deeper into the underground network, Elena's flashlight illuminated disturbing evidence that they weren't the first people to seek refuge in these tunnels. Personal belongings, makeshift shelters, and ominous stains on the concrete walls suggested that other survivors had attempted to hide underground, but their ultimate fate remained unclear. Marcus's medical training helped him recognize signs of violence and struggle that indicated the infected had somehow gained access to areas that should have been completely secure from surface-level threats. The tunnel system led them away from the industrial complex and toward the older sections of Phoenix, where infrastructure dating back decades created a hidden world beneath the city streets. David's knowledge of municipal engineering allowed him to identify maintenance shafts that provided access to communication lines, power grids, and water treatment facilities that were still partially functional despite the chaos above ground. These systems offered potential resources for survival, but they also revealed the terrifying scope of the infection's impact on urban civilization. Elena discovered the most disturbing evidence of the outbreak's true nature when they reached a junction connecting to the city's emergency communication network. Recorded messages from government officials revealed that similar fake safe zones had been established in multiple cities across the country, suggesting that the Phoenix outbreak was part of a coordinated national operation. The messages indicated that legitimate military and emergency response units were being overwhelmed or compromised, leaving survivors with no reliable way to distinguish between genuine rescue operations and deception traps. Marcus monitored emergency medical frequencies through equipment they found in an abandoned maintenance station, learning that hospitals throughout the region were reporting identical infection patterns and behavioral characteristics. The consistency of symptoms across different locations contradicted natural disease transmission models, confirming their suspicions that the outbreak was being deliberately controlled and managed from central locations. Most alarming were reports that suggested the infected were beginning to exhibit new capabilities, including the ability to operate complex machinery and coordinate sophisticated tactical operations. David's radio intercepted communications between the fake military personnel at the industrial complex and other facilities, revealing that their escape had indeed been discovered and that search teams were being deployed throughout the tunnel system. The conversations indicated that the facility operators considered the 3 survivors to be high-value subjects because of their professional backgrounds and their discovery of classified documents. Their capture had become a priority that was diverting resources from other collection operations, giving them unexpected strategic importance in whatever larger plan was being implemented. As they navigated deeper into the underground labyrinth, the survivors realized that their escape route was leading them directly toward the mountain research facility mentioned in the government documents they had found. The tunnel system connected to mining operations and geological surveys that provided access to the remote areas where the outbreak source was located. Their flight from one trap was inadvertently taking them toward the heart of the conspiracy, but it also offered their best chance of finding answers and potentially stopping the infection at its origin. The underground exodus had transformed them from victims into active participants in a conflict that was far larger than they had initially understood, but their survival now depended on reaching the source of humanity's nightmare before the forces controlling the outbreak could complete whatever devastating plan they had set in motion. The underground network led them through 3 miles of deteriorating infrastructure before emerging into natural cave systems that had been extensively modified with modern construction. David's flashlight revealed concrete reinforcements, ventilation shafts, and electrical conduits that suggested major excavation work had been conducted in complete secrecy. The caves connected to the mountainside facility through a series of blast doors and security checkpoints that had been abandoned so recently that coffee was still warm in the guard stations. Elena noticed that the access codes were still active, suggesting that whoever had operated this facility had left in tremendous haste. Marcus's medical background helped him interpret the laboratory equipment they discovered in the facility's lower levels. The research apparatus was far more sophisticated than anything he had encountered in civilian hospitals, with containment systems designed for handling extremely dangerous biological agents. Computer terminals throughout the complex displayed data about genetic modification, behavioral conditioning, and neural network manipulation that painted a horrifying picture of the infection's true purpose. The outbreak wasn't a weapon designed to kill humanity, but rather a tool for transforming it into something controllable and predictable. The central laboratory contained dozens of observation chambers where human subjects had been systematically infected and monitored during their transformation process. Elena found detailed video recordings that documented how the infection altered brain chemistry while preserving cognitive functions that made the subjects useful for specific tasks. The infected weren't mindless zombies, but rather human beings whose personalities and free will had been systematically removed while leaving their skills and memories intact. The transformation created perfect workers who could follow complex instructions without questioning authority or demanding compensation. David discovered the facility's communication center, where automated systems continued broadcasting the fake rescue operations that had nearly trapped them at the industrial complex. the equipment revealed a nationwide network of similar facilities, each responsible for processing survivors from designated geographic regions. Maps displayed the planned distribution of collection sites, research stations, and processing centers that covered the entire continental United States. The scope of the operation suggested coordination at the highest levels of government and industry, with participation from military contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and technology corporations. The most shocking revelation came when Elena accessed personnel files that identified the project's leadership. Dr. Amanda Foster, whose voice had lured them toward the fake safe zone, was actually the facility's director and the primary architect of the infection itself. Her research had been funded through classified government programs aimed at developing solutions to labor shortages, social unrest, and economic instability. The transformed humans were intended to replace traditional workers in dangerous industries, military operations, and social services where complete obedience was considered more valuable than individual creativity or independence. Marcus found medical records indicating that the transformation process could be reversed during its early stages, but only with treatments that required sophisticated laboratory equipment and rare biological compounds. The research had identified a narrow window of approximately 72 hours during which the infection could be neutralized before permanent brain chemistry changes occurred. However, the treatment protocols required direct access to the facility's specialized equipment and a comprehensive understanding of each subject's individual infection timeline. David's investigation of the facility's power and communication systems revealed that Dr. Foster and her core research team had evacuated to a secondary location when their automated containment systems malfunctioned. The backup facility was located deeper in the mountain complex, connected through emergency tunnels that were designed to provide secure evacuation routes for essential personnel. Intercepted communications indicated that the researchers were attempting to regain control of their experiment, which had apparently spread beyond their intended parameters and was threatening to consume the entire population rather than converting it into manageable numbers of compliant workers. Elena discovered the most crucial piece of information in Dr. Foster's personal files. The researcher had documented a kill switch protocol that could neutralize the infection through targeted electromagnetic pulses broadcasted on specific frequencies. The system was designed as a fail-safe mechanism to prevent uncontrolled spread, but it required simultaneous activation from multiple transmission stations to create the proper signal coverage. The coordinates for these stations were scattered throughout the southwestern United States, but the primary control system was located in the secondary facility where Dr. Foster had retreated. As they absorbed the full scope of the conspiracy they had uncovered, the three survivors realized that stopping the outbreak would require more than simply surviving until help arrived. The infection was designed to eventually consume the entire population unless the kill switch protocol could be activated, but accessing the necessary systems would mean confronting the researchers who had created this nightmare. Their underground exodus had brought them to the source of humanity's greatest threat, but it had also positioned them as the only people with the knowledge and access needed to prevent the complete transformation of human civilization. The final confrontation would determine whether humanity retained its freedom or became a species of biological robots serving their corporate masters. The secondary facility's emergency tunnels led them into a high-tech command center where Dr. Amanda Foster and 6 remaining researchers were desperately trying to regain control of their experiment. The woman who had nearly lured them into the collection trap was younger than her voice had suggested, with the intense focus of someone who had watched her life's work spiral into global catastrophe. When Marcus, Elena, and David emerged from the tunnel access point, she looked up from her computer terminals with a mixture of surprise and grim recognition that their presence represented both opportunity and judgment for her actions. Dr. Foster's initial reaction was to treat them as potential test subjects, but Elena's direct confrontation about the children she had seen being loaded into vehicles forced the researcher to acknowledge the moral implications of her work. Marcus leveraged his medical background to engage Foster in technical discussions about the kill switch protocol, learning that the electromagnetic pulse system required manual activation from 4 separate transmission stations positioned throughout Arizona, Nevada, and California. The activation sequence had to be synchronized within a 30-second window, making coordination between multiple teams absolutely essential for success. David's engineering expertise became crucial when they discovered that 3 of the 4 transmission stations had been overrun by infected populations that were being guided by the facility's automated control systems. The infected had been programmed to protect critical infrastructure, turning the very locations needed for humanity's salvation into heavily fortified strongholds. Foster revealed that she had lost contact with field teams at all 3 compromised stations, leaving only the primary control center at their current location as a functional part of the kill switch network. The solution required splitting their small group and attempting simultaneous missions that would test every skill they had developed during their survival ordeal. Elena volunteered to accompany Dr. Foster to the nearest transmission station, using her teaching background to coordinate complex timing sequences while Foster handled the technical activation procedures. Marcus would travel to the California station with 2 of Foster's research assistants, relying on his medical training to treat injuries and maintain team effectiveness during what would inevitably become a combat situation. David accepted the most dangerous assignment of reaching the Nevada station alone, using his construction and engineering knowledge to potentially bypass damaged equipment and restore functionality under hostile conditions. The coordinated assault on the transmission stations began at dawn, with each team facing unique challenges that tested their resourcefulness and determination. Elena and Dr. Foster encountered infected groups that had learned to set traps and coordinate ambush tactics, forcing them to use psychological strategies rather than direct confrontation to reach their objective. Marcus discovered that his medical skills were essential for treating research assistants who had been injured during previous attempts to access the California facility, but his team's success ultimately depended on performing delicate technical procedures while under constant attack from infected that showed increasing signs of strategic thinking. David's solitary mission to Nevada became a desperate race against time when he discovered that the facility's power systems had been sabotaged by infected who had retained enough technical knowledge to recognize the threat that the transmission station represented. His engineering background allowed him to improvise repairs using available materials, but the infected had gathered in massive numbers around the facility, suggesting that the outbreak's controlling intelligence had identified the kill switch locations as critical vulnerabilities that needed to be protected at all costs. The synchronization window arrived with all 3 teams in position but facing overwhelming odds that seemed impossible to overcome. Elena's coordination skills proved essential as she managed real-time communication between the scattered locations, adjusting timing sequences to accommodate the tactical situations that each team was encountering. Marcus led a diversionary assault that drew infected forces away from critical equipment long enough for his technical assistants to complete their activation procedures. David's engineering modifications to the Nevada station's power systems provided the extra seconds needed for all 4 locations to achieve simultaneous transmission of the electromagnetic pulse sequence. The kill switch activation created a visible shockwave that rippled across the infected populations, neutralizing the biological control mechanisms that had been driving their coordinated behavior. Within hours, the transformed humans began showing signs of cognitive recovery, though the psychological trauma of their experiences would require extensive rehabilitation and support. Dr. Foster's research data provided medical professionals with the information needed to treat infection survivors and prevent future outbreaks, but her personal accountability for the catastrophe would be determined by courts and communities seeking justice for the devastation. Marcus, Elena, and David emerged from their ordeal as unlikely heroes who had prevented the complete transformation of human civilization, but their real victory lay in demonstrating that ordinary people could overcome extraordinary threats through cooperation, determination, and the courage to confront evil regardless of its sophisticated presentation. The rebuilding process would take years, but humanity had retained its freedom to choose its own destiny rather than becoming biological property of corporate interests that had nearly succeeded in redefining the entire species.